Naomi Brooks knew the resignation letter would change her life, but she did not expect it to become evidence before the sun had fully risen over Manhattan. She placed the envelope in the center of Ethan Carter's walnut desk at 5:43 in the morning, aligning it with the wood grain out of habit, then noticed that his locked medical courier pouch was already open. The pouch had arrived the previous evening from St. Matthew Medical Center, and Naomi remembered placing it inside the secure drawer herself before leaving for her mother's cardiology appointment. Now the brass key remained in the lock. The seal had been cut cleanly, and one page was missing from the documents inside. She stood motionless beneath the dim office lights, listening to the quiet hum of the climate system while a question settled heavily inside her chest. Someone had entered Ethan's office after midnight, and whoever had done it had known exactly what to take. For 3 years, Naomi had served as executive assistant to the founder of Carter Global Holdings, although the title had never described the full weight of her work. She managed acquisitions, protected confidential schedules, corrected financial errors before they reached the board, and quietly translated Ethan's blunt decisions into language employees could trust. Her reliability had become so complete that people no longer thanked her, because they had stopped recognizing where the company ended and her invisible labor began. Ethan was not cruel, and that almost made leaving harder, because neglect without malice could remain invisible for years. He trusted her more than anyone in the building, yet he had never once asked what her life cost outside the office. Naomi's mother needed another cardiac evaluation, and Naomi had finally accepted that loyalty was no longer noble when it required abandoning the people who had loved her first. She photographed the broken seal, closed the pouch, and considered adding a warning to the resignation letter, but the private elevator chimed before she could decide. Naomi slipped the photograph into a secure folder on her phone, collected her handbag, and stepped into the mirrored car, while the executive floor disappeared behind polished steel. She had promised herself there would be no dramatic farewell, no final speech, and no attempt to make Ethan understand what he had never noticed on his own. Yet halfway to the lobby, her phone rang from a blocked number, and the voice on the other end introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Harrison from St. Matthew Medical Center. His tone remained controlled, but Naomi heard the strain beneath his professionalism when he asked whether Ethan had received the sealed results from his executive physical. She looked at her reflection in the elevator doors and answered carefully that the package had arrived, though she did not mention the missing page. Dr. Harrison paused long enough to change the temperature inside the call. He explained that preliminary imaging had revealed a possible structural abnormality requiring immediate evaluation. But he also admitted that one page containing the specialist's interpretation had disappeared from the hospital's digital archive overnight. The remaining notes were incomplete, which meant Ethan might believe the results were either routine or catastrophic, depending on which information reached him first. Naomi asked whether the condition was life-threatening, and the doctor refused to speculate without the missing report, though he warned that intense stress could be dangerous until the findings were confirmed. Then he asked a question that made Naomi tighten her grip on the phone. Had anyone from Carter Global contacted the hospital before dawn, requesting language for a public statement about Ethan's health? The elevator doors opened into the marble lobby, but Naomi did not move. She told Dr. Harrison that no legitimate employee should have known enough to make that request, because Ethan himself had not yet seen the results. The doctor lowered his voice and explained that the caller had used confidential reference numbers from Ethan's file, numbers available only inside the sealed courier packet or the hospital system. Naomi looked toward the security desk, where the overnight guard was speaking with a technician beside a blank surveillance monitor. At that moment, the broken seal upstairs no longer felt like a private intrusion. It felt like the opening move of something planned. She asked the doctor to send all available records directly to her encrypted work address, but he told her the access authorization had been changed at 4:12 that morning. Ethan's designated executive representative was no longer Naomi Brooks. Naomi crossed the lobby toward the security station and asked why the executive floor cameras were offline. The guard explained that a software update had caused a temporary failure between 2 and 4 in the morning, though his uncertain expression suggested he had already repeated the explanation more than once. Naomi requested the access log for Ethan's office, and the guard hesitated before admitting that the system showed her own credentials entering the suite at 2:17. She had been sitting beside her mother in a hospital waiting room at that exact time, holding a paper cup of cold coffee while a nurse reviewed medication changes. Someone had used her identity to enter the office, open Ethan's confidential file, and remove the only page capable of explaining whether his condition was manageable or severe. Her resignation had not merely created an absence. Someone had prepared to use that absence before she even announced it. Upstairs, Ethan Carter arrived at 6:30, carrying the same leather portfolio he had used through every major negotiation since founding the company. He noticed Naomi's envelope before he noticed the open drawer, because her absence altered the room in ways he could not immediately name. He read the resignation letter once, then again, stopping at the sentence in which she wrote that a life built entirely around another person's emergencies eventually stopped belonging to its owner. Ethan had negotiated hostile takeovers without visible emotion, but those words left him strangely unprepared. Before he could call her, Victor Langley, Carter Global's chief financial officer, entered without knocking and announced that the investor summit had been moved forward by 30 minutes. Ethan closed the letter, unaware that Victor's gaze briefly settled on the open medical pouch before returning to his carefully sympathetic smile. Victor encouraged Ethan to ignore the resignation until after the summit, arguing that companies survived because no individual was indispensable. Ethan replied that Naomi had never been merely an individual within the system, and Victor's expression tightened for less than a second. He then handed Ethan a revised speech containing a new paragraph about leadership continuity, a phrase Ethan did not remember approving. When Ethan questioned it, Victor blamed the communications department and suggested the language would reassure investors during uncertain markets. Ethan removed the paragraph, placed Naomi's letter inside his portfolio, and left for the hotel without examining the medical pouch. 28 floors below, Naomi watched his sedan disappear into traffic, while Dr. Harrison's warning echoed through her thoughts. Someone had stolen the truth about Ethan's heart, and in less than 1 hour, 500 investors would be waiting for him to prove he had nothing to hide. Naomi could have walked away, but the sight of Ethan's sedan turning toward Midtown made the decision impossible to defend. She had resigned because she could no longer sacrifice her life to a man who rarely noticed the cost, yet resignation did not erase responsibility when another person had been placed in danger through deliberate deception. She called Ethan twice, then his driver, and received no answer, because Summit Security required all executive devices to remain silenced before the live broadcast. Naomi returned to the security desk, requested a copy of the access report, and sent it to her private account before anyone could revoke her credentials completely. The guard warned that Victor Langley had ordered all overnight logs sealed, pending an internal review, which confirmed that someone inside senior leadership was already trying to control the sequence of facts. A taxi carried Naomi through morning traffic, while Dr. Harrison remained on the phone, explaining what he could without violating medical protocol. Ethan's imaging had revealed an irregular thickening near the left ventricular wall, a finding that could indicate a dangerous inherited condition or a far less serious adaptation caused by years of extreme stress. The missing specialist page contained the comparison measurements needed to distinguish between those possibilities, and without it, the hospital could not issue a responsible conclusion. Naomi asked why the digital archive had also been altered, and Dr. Harrison admitted that someone had used a board-authorized insurance portal to request temporary access to Ethan's executive health records. The request appeared to come from Carter Global's benefits office, but the authorization code belonged to Victor Langley's department. Naomi did not accuse him, because suspicion without proof was exactly the kind of uncertainty an experienced manipulator could exploit. At the Grand Regent Hotel, Ethan stood backstage beneath white television lights while Victor reviewed market projections beside him. The ballroom beyond the curtain held investors, journalists, employees, and board members who had flown across the country for the largest acquisition in Carter Global's history. Ethan should have been focused on the purchase of Meridian Freight Systems, a deal capable of expanding the company into 40 new regional markets. But Naomi's resignation letter remained inside his portfolio like an unanswered accusation. He remembered the nights she had quietly replaced his untouched dinner, the mornings she had rearranged meetings around appointments he later canceled, and the careful way she never asked for recognition. Those memories did not flatter him. They revealed the difference between believing someone was valued and behaving as though their life mattered. Victor interrupted Ethan's thoughts by asking whether Naomi had mentioned health concerns before leaving. Ethan turned toward him slowly, because the question arrived before he had told anyone about the hospital pouch. Victor corrected himself immediately, claiming he had heard Naomi discussing her mother's condition and assumed Ethan was distracted by the resignation. The explanation was plausible, but Ethan had built his company by noticing when polished answers arrived too quickly. Before he could press further, the master of ceremonies announced his name, and applause rolled through the ballroom. Ethan stepped onto the stage, delivering the opening lines with his usual control, while Victor moved toward the back row and sent a message from a second phone concealed beneath his folder. Naomi reached the hotel with 12 minutes remaining before the acquisition announcement. Daniel Morris, Carter Global's head of security, intercepted her near the ballroom entrance and told her that her access badge had been deactivated at 6:10, 20 minutes before Ethan discovered the resignation. Naomi showed him the photograph of the broken medical pouch, the fraudulent entry log, and the message from Dr. Harrison confirming unauthorized access. Daniel's expression changed as he understood that her departure had been anticipated rather than merely observed. He led her through a service corridor, but a summit supervisor stopped them at the final checkpoint and insisted that no one could interrupt a live investor presentation. Naomi could hear Ethan speaking beyond the curtain about stability, trust, and long-term responsibility, unaware that the company's most dangerous instability was standing somewhere inside the room. Dr. Harrison called again as Naomi argued with the supervisor, and this time his urgency had sharpened. The hospital had located a partial backup of the missing report, but several measurement fields were corrupted, making an immediate examination essential before Ethan continued under intense pressure. Naomi handed the phone to Daniel, moved past the supervisor, and entered the ballroom from the side aisle. Hundreds of faces turned toward her, though she saw only Ethan standing beneath the lights, one hand resting against the podium while the acquisition figures glowed behind him. For a moment she wondered whether public interruption would cause more harm than waiting, but then Ethan briefly pressed his fingers beneath his ribs and paused between sentences. The gesture could have meant nothing, yet uncertainty had already become too dangerous. Naomi stopped near the stage and called his name without raising her voice, but the microphone carried the sound across the ballroom. Ethan looked toward her with visible surprise, then noticed Daniel holding a phone beside the curtain and understood that the interruption was not emotional. Victor stood from his seat and suggested that security remove her, framing the moment as the reaction of a disgruntled former employee. Naomi met Ethan's eyes and said only that his medical file had been opened. One page was missing, and the hospital needed him immediately. The room erupted into murmurs, cameras shifted, and financial reporters began typing before Ethan had taken a single step. Victor's plan depended on confusion, but he had not expected Naomi to state the breach before the health concern. Ethan left the stage and followed Naomi into a private conference room where Dr. Harrison explained the uncertainty without exaggeration. He recommended immediate transport to the hospital, not because death was imminent, but because continuing the summit could turn an unclear risk into an unnecessary emergency. Ethan asked Naomi how she knew the file had been altered, and she showed him the photograph, the false access record, and the deactivated authorization. He studied the evidence in silence, then asked why she had returned after resigning. Naomi answered that leaving a position did not require leaving another human being inside a trap. Before Ethan could respond, the television mounted on the wall switched to breaking coverage announcing that Carter Global's chief executive had abandoned the summit amid rumors of a concealed cardiac condition. The report cited an anonymous board source claiming Ethan had hidden months of medical warnings from shareholders, although Ethan had learned about the findings less than 30 minutes earlier. Carter Global stock began falling before the anchor finished the sentence, and Victor entered the conference room carrying a prepared succession statement dated the previous evening. He advised Ethan to transfer temporary authority before panic damaged the acquisition, presenting the proposal as an act of corporate responsibility. Naomi looked at the printed document, then at the timestamp on the internal media leak appearing on Daniel's tablet. The rumor had been distributed 7 minutes before she entered the ballroom, which meant the market crisis was not a reaction to Ethan leaving the stage. Someone had written the outcome before the event occurred. Ethan did not sign the succession statement, although Victor pressed the pen toward him with the patience of a man pretending urgency was compassion. Instead, Ethan asked why a document describing concealed cardiac instability had been prepared before the hospital contacted him, and Victor replied that responsible corporations modeled every possible leadership risk. His answer sounded reasonable until Naomi pointed out that the statement referenced the exact hospital department and the same incomplete diagnostic language used in Dr. Harrison's preliminary notes. Victor's expression remained composed, but his fingers tightened around the folder as Daniel quietly stepped between him and the door. Ethan instructed Victor to return to the ballroom and reassure the board that no transfer of authority would occur until verified medical information existed. Once Victor left, Naomi studied the succession statement while Daniel contacted Carter Global's cybersecurity team. The document contained no direct falsehoods because it had been written with the precision of someone who understood that implication could damage trust more effectively than accusation. It suggested that Ethan had failed to disclose a material health risk, though no diagnosis had been confirmed, and it recommended immediate appointment of an interim chief executive to protect the Meridian acquisition. Naomi recognized several phrases from Victor's earlier board presentations, especially his repeated claim that systems should never depend on one person. The ideology was not suspicious by itself, but combined with the stolen report, manipulated credentials, and timed leak, it revealed an ambition disguised as governance. Ethan agreed to go to the hospital only after recording a brief statement for investors. Naomi rewrote his first draft because it sounded defensive, replacing explanations with a direct acknowledgement that a confidential medical matter had been improperly disclosed before doctors completed their review. She advised him to postpone the acquisition rather than pretend certainty, arguing that transparent delay would damage the market less than a rushed performance built on fear. Ethan resisted because Meridian's owners had threatened to reopen negotiations if the announcement failed, but Naomi reminded him that leadership was not the art of appearing invulnerable. It was the discipline of refusing to let other people pay for a lie he had been pressured to maintain. The statement aired 10 minutes later, calming some investors while provoking others, and Ethan left through a private entrance with Naomi and Daniel. During the drive to St. Matthew, Ethan asked why her credentials had been used while she attended her mother's appointment. Naomi explained that Victor knew her schedule because he had requested a meeting that afternoon, then canceled after confirming she would be away from the office. Ethan remembered approving Victor's recent demand for expanded access to administrative systems during the Meridian negotiations, a decision he had made without consulting Naomi. The realization forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Victor had not defeated their security by being brilliant. He had exploited Ethan's habit of assuming competent people would absorb every consequence without complaint. At the hospital, Dr. Harrison ordered cardiac monitoring, blood tests, and a new imaging study while Naomi waited outside the examination unit. She considered leaving because Ethan was now surrounded by professionals, but Daniel asked her to review the company's access history before Victor could erase additional evidence. The cybersecurity team had discovered that Naomi's credentials were not stolen through hacking. They had been duplicated from a temporary administrative token issued by the finance department during a software migration. Only 3 executives had approved the migration, and Victor had insisted that the old tokens remain active for 48 hours after Naomi's resignation was expected to take effect. The timing suggested that her departure had been incorporated into the plan long before she placed the letter on Ethan's desk. Naomi asked how Victor could have known she intended to resign, then remembered the private draft saved on her office computer 2 weeks earlier. She had written the letter after missing her mother's first specialist appointment, but she had not printed or sent it until that morning. Daniel found that someone had opened the draft at 1:14 in the morning using the same duplicated token later used to enter Ethan's office. The intruder had not merely discovered her resignation. He had confirmed it hours before executing the breach. Naomi felt anger rise beneath her composure, not because Victor had used her decision, but because he had turned her exhaustion into a weapon against the company she had spent years protecting. Ethan emerged from the examination room after nearly 2 hours, pale from fatigue but medically stable. Dr. Harrison explained that the new imaging showed no immediate obstruction, though a specialist still needed to determine whether the abnormality was inherited or stress-related. The condition was serious enough to require changes, but not the imminent catastrophe described in the market rumor. Ethan's relief was tempered by the knowledge that someone had transformed uncertainty into a corporate weapon, and he asked Dr. Harrison, who had requested access to his records. The doctor provided a compliance report showing that the request originated from Carter Global's executive benefits portal under Victor's authorization code, but the digital signature belonged to a benefits manager named Laura Mendez. Daniel contacted Laura while Ethan remained under observation, only to learn that she had been placed on emergency leave that morning after an anonymous complaint accused her of mishandling confidential data. Laura insisted she had never opened Ethan's medical file and revealed that Victor had asked her to approve a routine portal test 2 days earlier. She had entered her password during a video call while Victor's systems analyst guided her through the process, unknowingly creating the credentials later used to access the hospital archive. Naomi recognized the pattern immediately. Victor avoided committing each act himself, distributing responsibility across employees who believed they were performing ordinary tasks. His plan was designed to survive investigation by making every individual mistake appear innocent. The hospital compliance team then recovered a fragment of the deleted specialist report, and the missing page contained a handwritten note recommending that Ethan reduce stress and undergo genetic testing because his father had died unexpectedly at 48. Ethan stared at the note, revealing that his father's death had always been described within the family as an accident. The medical warning was real, but someone had removed the page because it contained a second detail unrelated to the diagnosis. The specialist had compared Ethan's imaging with an older scan ordered anonymously 6 months earlier. Ethan had never authorized that scan, and the insurance payment came from a private account linked to the Meridian acquisition. The health crisis had not been discovered that morning. Someone had been studying his vulnerability for half a year. The older scan changed the investigation because it proved that Victor's plan had begun long before Naomi's resignation and long before the Meridian summit. Dr. Harrison explained that the scan had been performed through a mobile executive wellness service during Carter Global's annual leadership retreat, where employees underwent routine blood pressure checks and non-invasive screenings. Ethan remembered a technician asking him to stand before a portable imaging device, though he had assumed it was part of the approved program. The service provider had been hired through a consulting firm recommended by Victor, and the resulting data had never entered Ethan's official medical record until someone compared it with the recent examination. Victor had not created Ethan's condition, but he had quietly waited for the day uncertainty could be converted into authority. Naomi remained careful not to let suspicion become certainty before the evidence could support it. She told Daniel that Victor's motive still required explanation, because ambition alone did not justify risking thousands of employees and a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. Daniel searched financial records connected to Meridian and discovered that Victor controlled a private investment partnership through 2 intermediaries, both of whom had purchased debt from Meridian months earlier. If the acquisition collapsed after Carter Global's stock decline, the debt could be converted into ownership at a reduced valuation, allowing Victor's partners to profit regardless of which company survived. If Ethan transferred authority instead, Victor could complete the acquisition under terms favorable to the same investors. The plan had not been designed merely to replace a chief executive. It had been designed to win through either panic or surrender. Ethan listened from the hospital chair while the evidence accumulated, and his first instinct was to call the board immediately. Naomi stopped him because Victor had likely prepared for accusation, and a premature confrontation would allow him to destroy records or portray Ethan as medically unstable. She proposed allowing the emergency board meeting to proceed while they collected independent verification from the hospital, the cybersecurity team, and Meridian's lenders. Ethan questioned whether she still had authority to coordinate such an operation after resigning. Naomi answered that authority had never been the source of her effectiveness, though she added that once the crisis ended, she would not return to the life that had forced her to resign. Ethan accepted the condition without asking her to reconsider, which was the first sign that he had begun listening rather than simply needing her. They returned to Carter Global shortly before the board meeting, entering through the underground garage to avoid reporters. Victor had already circulated a proposal recommending his appointment as interim chief executive for 90 days, supported by market projections showing further decline if uncertainty continued. Several directors considered the proposal prudent, especially because Ethan's medical details remained confidential and the Meridian sellers were threatening withdrawal. Naomi stayed outside the boardroom, reviewing documents with Laura Mendez through a secure call, while Ethan entered with Daniel and Dr. Harrison's written statement confirming that no diagnosis impaired his ability to serve. The board chairwoman, Margaret Sloan, opened the meeting by warning that personal conflict would not replace evidence. Victor presented his case with polished restraint, never attacking Ethan directly and repeatedly describing the transfer as temporary. He emphasized fiduciary duty, employee stability, and investor protection, choosing language that made resistance appear selfish. Ethan allowed him to finish, then placed the succession statement and hospital access report on the table. Victor admitted authorizing the benefits portal test but claimed Laura had misused the credentials afterward, an explanation supported by the digital signature attached to the request. The board members turned toward one another, uncertain whether the evidence proved conspiracy or merely administrative failure. Outside the room, Naomi realized that Victor had intentionally framed Laura in advance, expecting investigators to stop at the first identifiable employee. Laura then remembered that the video call had been recorded automatically by Carter Global's compliance system. Daniel located the archived file, but the audio had been deleted while the visual stream remained intact. Naomi watched the silent footage frame by frame and noticed Victor's systems analyst leaving the room halfway through the test, while a reflection in the glass wall revealed Victor sitting beside him. At one point, Laura turned away to retrieve a document, and Victor leaned toward the keyboard before the screen changed. The image did not prove what he typed, but it contradicted his claim that he had never participated directly. Daniel brought the recording into the boardroom, and Victor's composure weakened as Margaret asked why he had concealed his presence. Victor replied that he had observed the test briefly, then accused Ethan of using a private medical scare to distract from failed leadership. He argued that Naomi's resignation demonstrated internal dysfunction and suggested that her return was motivated by personal loyalty rather than objective judgment. The accusation carried enough truth to be dangerous, because Naomi did care about Ethan, though not in the simple way Victor intended the board to assume. Ethan refused to defend their relationship and instead acknowledged that Naomi had resigned because he had allowed the company to depend on her without respecting the cost. His admission unsettled the room more than denial would have, because leaders rarely confessed a failure that could not be blamed on someone else. While the board considered the evidence, Naomi received a message from Meridian's founder, Charles Weller, requesting a private call. He revealed that Victor had approached him 3 months earlier with an alternative acquisition structure that would transfer control of Meridian's debt to an investment group after Ethan stepped aside. Charles had rejected the proposal because it weakened employee protections, but Victor warned that Carter Global's leadership would soon become too unstable to dictate terms. Charles had dismissed the comment as negotiation pressure until the health rumors appeared. He agreed to provide the emails, though he warned that one message referenced someone inside Ethan's family who had supplied information about his father's medical history. Naomi felt the case shift again, because Victor could not have known the significance of Ethan's inherited risk without access to family records. She entered the boardroom and handed Margaret the Meridian correspondence, including Victor's prediction of leadership instability. Victor read the messages, then abandoned his earlier calm and claimed the language had been taken out of context. Ethan asked who had given him information about his father, and Victor answered that the question was irrelevant to corporate governance. Margaret disagreed, suspending Victor's authority pending an independent investigation, but Victor did not appear defeated. As security approached, he looked toward Ethan and said that the board had only uncovered the part of the plan designed for them to find. Victor's final words followed Ethan into the corridor, where reporters gathered behind security barriers and employees watched from distant offices. Daniel ordered Victor's devices secured, but the chief financial officer had arrived with only a company phone that had been wiped remotely minutes before his suspension. The independent investigation could reconstruct much of the financial scheme, yet the missing family source remained capable of explaining how Victor had identified Ethan's medical vulnerability. Naomi asked Ethan who knew the truth about his father's death, and he answered that only his mother and older brother had access to the original records. His brother, Michael Carter, had left the company 7 years earlier after a bitter dispute over their father's estate, and had refused contact with Ethan ever since. Ethan resisted calling Michael because their last conversation had ended with accusations neither man had withdrawn. Naomi told him that unresolved family wounds often became useful to people who understood how to offer validation without healing anything. Victor may have approached Michael not as an accomplice, but as someone willing to confirm a grievance. Ethan finally agreed, and Daniel traced Michael to a small architecture firm in Philadelphia. When Ethan called, Michael answered with guarded silence, then admitted that Victor had contacted him 8 months earlier while researching succession risks. Michael had shared their father's autopsy summary because he believed Ethan was repeating the same destructive work habits, and Victor had promised the information would support a confidential wellness intervention. Michael denied knowing about the market scheme and sounded genuinely shaken when Ethan explained how the records had been used. He forwarded every message, including one in which Victor asked whether Ethan ever experienced chest pressure after long meetings. Michael had answered honestly, remembering an incident during their father's memorial when Ethan briefly lost his breath and refused medical attention. Victor then arranged the mobile scan at the leadership retreat, confirming a risk he could later weaponize. Ethan listened without anger, because the betrayal did not come from hatred. It came from a brother who believed secrecy could protect someone he no longer knew how to approach. For the first time in years, Ethan asked Michael why he had truly left the company. Michael explained that their father had not died in an accident, as Ethan had been told, but from an undiagnosed inherited heart condition worsened by years of exhaustion. Their mother had concealed the truth because Ethan was 23, newly responsible for the failing family business, and already determined to prove he could save it. Michael wanted to sell the company and protect them both, while Ethan interpreted his resistance as cowardice and forced the buyout that ended their relationship. The empire Ethan later built had grown from a misunderstanding buried beneath grief. Victor did not invent the fracture. He merely recognized that unspoken pain remained easier to manipulate than resolved truth. Naomi watched Ethan absorb the revelation without offering quick comfort, because some wounds deserved silence before advice. He finally admitted that he had spent his adult life trying to defeat the weakness that killed his father, without knowing weakness had never been the cause. His father had died because he ignored limits, concealed fear, and confused sacrifice with leadership. Naomi replied that repeating the pattern would not honor him, no matter how successful the result appeared from outside. Ethan then asked whether she had resigned because she saw the same pattern in him. Naomi answered that she resigned because she had started repeating it in herself. The investigation advanced rapidly once Michael's messages connected Victor to the early medical surveillance. Federal financial regulators began reviewing the Meridian debt partnership, and the board froze all acquisition activity until the ownership structure could be verified. Victor's attorney insisted that gathering health information had been intended to protect shareholders, but the recovered emails showed him coordinating market positions with the private investment group. The evidence was strong enough for formal charges to become possible, though Naomi warned Ethan not to turn justice into spectacle. Victor had built his plan on the belief that every human weakness could be converted into leverage, and the most complete defeat would be a transparent process that refused to imitate his methods. The following morning, Ethan addressed Carter Global employees from the company atrium instead of the executive stage. He admitted that private medical information had been misused, that leadership systems had concentrated too much knowledge in too few people, and that Naomi's resignation exposed failures extending beyond one criminal scheme. He announced an independent governance review, stronger employee protections, and a temporary pause on the Meridian acquisition until both companies could guarantee that workers would not pay for executive misconduct. The stock declined again during the statement, but employee messages flooded internal channels with support because uncertainty spoken honestly felt safer than confidence manufactured through concealment. After the address, Ethan found Naomi packing the remaining belongings from her office. He told her the board wanted her to stay as interim chief operating advisor, but she refused the title because accepting during the crisis would make her loyalty appear transactional. She agreed to complete a 30-day transition, provided the company hired additional staff and stopped treating endless availability as excellence. Ethan accepted every condition, then apologized without defending himself. He acknowledged that gratitude spoken only after someone leaves can become another form of selfishness, because it asks the exhausted person to return and repair the damage they suffered. Naomi did not forgive him immediately, though she respected that he finally understood apology was not a negotiation. Later that evening, Michael arrived in Manhattan and met Ethan in the quiet hospital chapel where their father had once waited through surgery years earlier. The brothers spoke for nearly 3 hours, not resolving 7 years of resentment, but finally separating what had happened from what they had assumed. Michael admitted that sharing the medical records had been reckless, while Ethan admitted that success had allowed him to avoid questioning the story that justified his anger. When they left the chapel, no dramatic reconciliation followed, only a promise to continue the conversation after Ethan's genetic testing. Some relationships were not repaired by one revelation. They were rebuilt through the willingness to return after the truth made distance easier. 3 days later, Dr. Harrison confirmed that Ethan carried the same inherited cardiac condition that had killed his father, though early detection made treatment and long-term management highly effective. The diagnosis brought fear, but it also ended the uncertainty Victor had exploited. Ethan would need medication, regular monitoring, fewer extreme work hours, and a life no longer organized around proving endurance. Naomi stood beside him as the doctor explained the changes, then reminded Ethan that survival was not a temporary project to complete before returning to old habits. He looked at her and understood that the crisis had not asked whether he could remain chief executive. It had asked whether he could become a man whose life was worth more than the company built around it. 1 year later, the glass atrium of the Carter Community Heart and Leadership Center filled with families rather than investors. The building stood on a former Carter Global warehouse site in Queens, transformed into a clinic offering cardiac screening, counseling, and workplace health programs for people whose jobs rarely allowed them time to seek care. Ethan had funded the center, but Naomi had insisted that his name remain secondary to its purpose, because charity built around personal redemption could easily become another monument to ego. The board agreed, and the entrance plaque carried a sentence written by a group of nurses instead of corporate communications. No one should have to become indispensable before being treated as human. Carter Global had recovered without rushing the Meridian acquisition, which was completed 6 months later under revised terms protecting employees, pension funds, and regional operations. Victor Langley eventually pleaded guilty to securities fraud, unlawful access to protected medical information, and conspiracy to manipulate corporate control. His downfall did not come from a single dramatic confession, but from the same details he had dismissed in other people: a benefits manager's recorded call, a security guard's access log, a brother's archived messages, and Naomi's photograph of a broken seal. He had believed quiet workers were interchangeable because he noticed systems more easily than human judgment. In the end, the people he underestimated became the record he could not erase. Naomi never returned to her former position, and Ethan never asked her to. After completing the transition, she spent 3 months caring for her mother, whose treatment stabilized after a successful procedure and a slower recovery than either of them expected. During that time, Naomi rejected 2 offers from competing corporations because both praised her ability to handle impossible workloads without questioning why the workload remained impossible. She later accepted Carter Global's offer to become Chief Operating Officer only after the board divided her former responsibilities among an expanded executive team. The promotion did not reward sacrifice. It recognized leadership that had existed long before anyone attached authority to it. Her relationship with Ethan changed more slowly than the company's organizational chart. They remained careful during the investigation, aware that gratitude, fear, and dependence could imitate intimacy when people survived the same crisis. Ethan began therapy, followed his treatment plan, and rebuilt contact with Michael without expecting immediate closeness. Naomi learned to leave work while problems remained unfinished, a discipline that initially felt more frightening than exhaustion. Their affection grew through ordinary choices rather than declarations, including dinners that ended before midnight, conversations that did not become strategy sessions, and weekends when neither of them carried a company phone. On the morning the center opened, Ethan arrived without an entourage and found Naomi helping an elderly man complete a digital intake form. She wore a dark blue suit and the same gold watch her mother had given her after graduation, though her expression carried a calm he had never seen during their years in the executive office. When the man thanked her, Naomi replied that no one should have to understand complicated systems while they were afraid. Ethan recognized the philosophy because it had shaped every crisis she solved for him, though he had once mistaken compassion for efficiency. Now he understood that her greatest skill was not anticipating problems. It was noticing the people hidden inside them. During the opening ceremony, Ethan spoke for less than 5 minutes, ignoring the longer remarks prepared by the communications team. He told the audience that the center existed because a private crisis exposed a public failure, one shared by companies that celebrated endurance while quietly consuming the lives of dependable people. He did not mention Victor by name, and he did not present himself as a hero who had survived betrayal. Instead, he thanked the employees who documented irregularities, the doctors who refused pressure, the board members who chose evidence over convenience, and the woman whose resignation forced him to understand what his success had required from others. Naomi listened from the side of the room, moved not by praise, but by the absence of performance in his voice. After the ceremony, Michael joined them near the clinic garden, where their mother sat beneath a maple tree, speaking with Naomi's mother. The 2 families had met only recently, and the gathering remained imperfect, filled with pauses, old caution, and stories that corrected years of mistaken assumptions. Ethan's mother apologized for hiding the truth about his father, explaining that fear had convinced her silence would protect her sons. Ethan did not tell her the pain no longer mattered, because forgiveness did not require rewriting harm into innocence. He simply took her hand and said they would stop protecting one another with secrets. As afternoon light moved across the atrium, Naomi found the original resignation letter inside a small envelope Ethan had carried from the old office. He told her he had kept it because it marked the day he nearly lost everything he had mistaken for permanent. Naomi unfolded the page and read the calm, restrained words written by a woman too tired to explain what should have been visible. She no longer felt anger toward that earlier version of herself, only compassion for how long she had believed strength meant enduring neglect gracefully. Ethan asked whether she regretted leaving, and Naomi answered that resigning had been the first honest decision either of them made. Ethan then admitted that he had once believed the phone call from the hospital saved his life, but he no longer considered that the full truth. The doctors protected his heart, the investigation protected the company, and the evidence exposed Victor, yet Naomi's departure revealed something none of those events could diagnose. Ethan had built an organization capable of measuring profit, risk, and growth, while remaining blind to the human cost carried by its most reliable people. Naomi replied that institutions rarely become cruel through one dramatic decision. They become cruel when good people repeatedly accept what should have been changed. The lesson applied to companies, families, and private lives alike. They stood together near the entrance, as another family arrived for free genetic screening, uncertain, but no longer alone. Ethan had learned that leadership did not mean becoming impossible to replace, and Naomi had learned that love, loyalty, and responsibility were not proven by disappearing inside another person's needs. Their future remained unwritten, though neither of them required a perfect ending to recognize a meaningful beginning. The company survived, the truth emerged, two families began repairing what silence had damaged, and a stolen medical page ultimately created a place where thousands of people could receive answers before fear became tragedy. Naomi placed the resignation letter inside the center's first archival box, not as a symbol of regret, but as evidence that walking away could sometimes become the most responsible form of hope. Ethan closed the lid beside her, then followed as she crossed the bright atrium toward their waiting families. Neither of them looked back at the office where the story began, because the life they had built afterward no longer depended on crisis, invisibility, or sacrifice. It rested on something quieter and far more difficult to corrupt. The decision to see people clearly before losing them forced the truth into view.